Welcome to Crossroads. There are growing signs of discontent, let's say, in the relationship between Russia and the Chinese Communist Party. Now, the two countries, they signed a no-limits agreement around the war in Ukraine, and they're moving to create a new security alliance. It's kind of similar to NATO. But the CCP seems to have some concerns. Russia is playing the subordinate in this relationship, and as the two move forward, old tensions over who's in charge seem to be emerging. But first, let's talk about the emerging kind of alliance they have. This is Foreign Policy 2023. It said the increasingly close relationship between China and Russia has been decades in the making, but Russia's invasion of Ukraine has tightened their embrace. Both countries made a clear strategic choice to prioritize relations with each other, given what they perceive as a common threat from the U.S.-led West. The deepening of bilateral ties is accompanied by a joint push for global realignment as the two countries use non-Western multilateral institutions, such as the BRICS Forum and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, to expand their influence in the developing world. Now, since then, they've moved to establish their own rival to NATO through the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, just recently, in fact. They're pushing for trade agreements among the member states throughout Eurasia mostly, as well as a new security alliance, the one's being compared to NATO. Now, as we've discussed before, when NATO also recently declared the Chinese Communist Party as the enabler of Russia in its war with Ukraine, the Chinese Communist Party responded to that criticism in the meetings by holding military exercises in Belarus right on the border of Ukraine and Poland, sending, of course, a direct message to NATO during a time when the CCP is being blamed for involvement in that. Then the joint, CCP and Russia military exercises held just after that in the South China Sea. And that was, of course, taken by many to suggest that the alliance goes both ways. Not only would the Chinese Communist Party back Russia in Ukraine, again, in the military exercises in Belarus were a clear sign of that, but Russia could back the CCP in a possible invasion of Taiwan. And of course, the reference of them being in the South China Sea holding military exercises was taken as a reference to that. Now, there's actually something more to this, though, something very important. Remember the assessment on the CCP being the enabler of Russia's war in Ukraine is that Russia would not be able to keep the war going without the aid of the CCP. That's the very nature of the idea that the CCP is the enabler. You remove the enabler, well, what happens to it? This suggests that Russia may not have the power that it used to have, and that it could have already been forced to a negotiating table if the Chinese Communist Party were not playing that role. So what's the way of doing with it, right? Well, as a way of dealing with this, of getting rid of the enabler, so to speak, the United States is about to hit China with sanctions. And even, of course, NATO allies are considering the same. Sanctions that could possibly even hit the Chinese banks. And that would be at a time, of course, when China, right now as we speak, they could not afford that. The Chinese Communist Party is facing a banking crisis. They're having an issue, of course, where debt is finally catching up with them. One of the main models of the CCP's economy for a long time has been mega projects, building huge ghost cities, places nobody lives, building freeways to nowhere, building airports in the middle of nowhere. Nobody uses them. They don't make money, but what they did was they took out huge bank loans, and the local governments did these mega projects with the hope that it would flow money within the economy. Eventually, the thing didn't make any money. The loans are still there. The debt builds up. The banks, of course, dealt with the breadth of that, and they're now at the breaking point. If they get sanctioned at this time, it will be devastating to the Chinese economy. But even aside from the banks, the Chinese Communist Party is facing an economic crisis on many other fronts. And all of these are likewise facing pressure both inside China and abroad. So the question is this. If Russia needs the CCP in order to keep the war going, if that continued aid depends on the CCP having the economic capacity to pay for it and keep the war going, and if the new target of the United States and NATO is to now remove that economic factor, to sanction the CCP to the degree that it can no longer play the role of enabling Russia in its war, if that goes away, then what benefit is there for Russia to have that alliance? Well, look, on Russia's side, what they get from the CCP is the support of the Chinese economic system. On the CCP side, well, the CCP wants Russia as a building block for this imagined new world order, right? The multipolar world order with the China model at the forefront. That's what they're talking about. And that vision is quickly fading because the CCP is facing the reality that its influence through money is starting to disappear. And then, of course, there's also the possible political shifts taking place in the United States. Look, on the Republican side, for example, including with former President Donald Trump's running mate J.D. Vance, there's a push to shift defense focus from Russia to China. And we can actually see this shift already happening to an extent, including, for example, with NATO now regarding the CCP as the hand pulling the strings. The CCP is the force behind the scenes making it rain, right? So the real questions are, would Russia still choose the CCP and its tightening access to the world that it's facing if it stays with it, if the war in Ukraine were no longer there? Would it still align itself with the CCP if the main thing that the Chinese Communist Party has to offer, economic power and an alternative financial system outside the US dollar, and therefore outside US sanctions, if that just goes away? What happens if the incentives in the alliance for Russia are removed? Well, that's where we're at now. And it seems right now there are signs the relationship is actually already on shaky grounds. It's a bit of a one-sided toxic relationship, with the Chinese Communist Party very heavily focused on its own needs in ways that actually go against Russia's interests in many, many regards. Things that take advantage of Russia, things that are overriding Russia's trade partnerships and so on. Russia's becoming subservient to the CCP in this relationship. Wall Street Journal says that in Central Asia, which Moscow regards as its backyard, the friendship that both have declared as having no limits, again, Russia and China, is colliding with Beijing's global ambitions. It notes that China has seized on the Ukrainian vision to chip away at traditional Russian spheres of influence. It notes that in Central Asia, as in the Arctic, which again both China and Russia are involved with, Moscow's reliance on Beijing to sustain its war machine forces it to acquiesce on the encroachments. It notes that across the strategically situated region, Beijing, the CCP, is drawing local economies into its orbit. It notes that Chinese investments are diverting the region's young workers away from Russia. A Chinese-funded railroad promises to connect it with Europe, bypassing Russian territory. Chinese renewable energy projects are helping reduce its reliance on Russian gas. And notably as well, even as Europe itself has become less reliant on Russia for energy, the CCP is also trying to sell these renewables to most of Europe. The CCP is taking away Russia's market, in other words. Now, through this relationship, Russia is finding itself increasingly isolated, not just from the West, but even from its former allies and trade partners, organizations that are now within their orbit with the CCP, but the CCP is dominating those. I'll be talking about this more after we come back from a quick break.
Experts agree, one of the best ways to protect against financial uncertainty is to diversify your portfolio. Learn how physical gold and silver can secure your retirement funds from today's economic challenges. With a gold IRA from American Hartford Gold, you can safeguard your wealth with no penalties or taxes when you transfer your current qualifying retirement accounts. Call now and our precious metals specialists will send you a free information kit, no cost or obligation. American Hartford Gold, a trusted industry leader with an A+ from the Better Business Bureau, has a 5-star rating from thousands of happy clients. Whether you are getting physical precious metals in a gold IRA or delivered to your doorstep, we offer only the highest quality gold and silver. For your peace of mind, we also offer a no-fee buyback commitment, a low price guarantee, along with free shipping and free insurance. So don't wait. Call the number on your screen today and secure your financial future.
Welcome back. The alliance between Russia and the Chinese Communist Party is on shaky ground. Now, there's a growing distrust between the two countries, and they had signed, of course, this no limits agreement with each other. The countries are currently moving to create a new security alliance similar to NATO, but the CCP seems to have some concerns, very odd ones. Russia is, of course, playing the subordinate role in this whole relationship, but tensions over who's in charge and who's actually benefiting from it, these are now coming to the forefront. A lot of these issues actually go back to the Cold War. There's a long history to this. Even during that time, Russia and the former Soviet Union, they had a type of, frenemy relationship with the Chinese Communist Party. They worked together, they didn't necessarily like each other. The situation actually got so tense, in fact, that they even had land battles. They shot each other, they fought each other. They weren't fully declared wars, but they were serious. One of them, of course, being the Sino-Soviet border conflict in 1969. It actually got so bad that the Soviets reportedly wanted to use nuclear weapons against China. In fact, they even allegedly asked the United States for permission to do that without facing retaliatory attacks from the US. And the United States intervened and stopped Russia during the Cold War from nuking China. Allegedly, again, according to people who were there at the time. Now, the conflict in 1969 was actually very similar to what's happening right now. The Soviet Union at the time was regarded as the leader of the world communist revolution, the entire bloc around that type of ideology. The Chinese Communist Party at the time was regarded as the little brother, right? The smaller ally under the Soviet agenda. But as the CCP began to expand, because again, the CCP started playing a global role, including with the invasion of Tibet, the takeover of Xinjiang, and with conflicting interests over Soviet-backed communist revolutions abroad, in Africa, in Latin America, in parts of Asia like Vietnam. You had conflicting interests. And some of these revolutionary groups, they were traveling to China, some were traveling to Russia. And they were getting trained either on the whole Stalinist model of revolution or on the Maoist model of revolution. And what happened is their, let's say, competing interests began to come to a head. And as the Chinese Communist Party was, again, making it so that they were challenging Russia's hold on the communist world, the two countries started having territorial disputes. And they also started having disputes when the status quo started to change. Who was the leader and who was the subordinate? Well, eventually the Soviet bloc started having internal conflicts. The benefits that Russia could offer the CCP, well, they started drying up. The relationship was on rocky ground, and the Chinese Communist Party, well, they found someone better. They found the United States. The Chinese Communist Party did so-called reform and opening up in 1978. It got offered trade agreements, access to Western markets, and it took the offer. That was when, of course, Nixon was going to China and meeting with them. And you had, of course, Deng Xiaoping traveling to the United States and putting on a cowboy hat. Suddenly, China did not need Russia anymore. And the Soviet Union went into collapse. Now we find something very similar happening, only it's the other way around. In countries where Russia used to hold a lot of sway, the Chinese Communist Party is taking over. The two are working to form trade alliances, but it's increasingly being shown these are tilted very heavily in the interests of the Chinese Communist Party. And it seems the CCP is even trying to cut Russia out in these deals, including what's building infrastructure projects bypassing Russia, or doing energy deals that damage Russia's market. Russia, still, of course, they benefit from the CCP's support for the war in Ukraine, but Western powers, including the United States and NATO allies, they're now seeing that the Chinese Communist Party is what's making it all possible. And if you remove that element, the CCP, then the war might be forced to end. And this is because Russia is becoming too economically isolated. It has become too dependent on China. And China is now the weak link in that whole thing. The conversation said this. They said Russia is now so dependent on the only major economy still taking the risk to support its regime that China could effectively force Vladimir Putin to end the conflict. It says the extent of Russia's economic dependence became apparent fairly quickly after its full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. Just a few months later, things were not going to plan. In the hopes of putting pressure on European countries supporting Ukraine, Russia decided to cut almost all of its exports of gas to the West. And it's before the war, Russia had provided about 40% of Europe's gas. While at first that decision provoked an energy crisis and surge in bills across the continent, all through the EU, Europe eventually managed to wean itself from Russia's supply. They didn't need it no more. They did this, it says, in part by replacing gas with other sources of energy, but also by substituting Russian imports with gas from other countries, including the United States. Now they note China is the only potential customer large enough to justify a new pipeline to replace the ones which used to deliver to Europe. But given this privileged position, China feels able to demand the gas at a huge discount. They're not, of course, paying market value for Russian gas because they know that Russia can't go to anybody else, basically. And they note that in this kind of bargaining situation, China has the upper hand. China can buy gas from anywhere in the world, but Russia can only sell it at the volumes it needs to China. Then there's the question, it says, of urgency. Russia needs to finance a war right now, while China has no pressing energy need that it cannot fulfill. One needs one, the other doesn't need the other. In other words, Russia's finding itself cut off. Europe doesn't technically need it anymore. The Chinese Communist Party can keep Russia sustained, but it doesn't have to. They have other options. And so this has caused dependence, and the CCP has the upper hand. They've been notably taking advantage of this fact that they have the upper hand, buying Russian oil, for example, below market value. Again, because the CCP has the advantage and they're taking it. I'll be talking more about what's next for the Chinese economy, though, exclusively on EpochTV.com. It's the uncensored streaming platform of the Epoch Times. So if you're watching on YouTube, Facebook, X, Rumble, there's a link in the description below. Click that, get access to the rest of this episode. And not only will you get that, but also my whole library of shows, family-friendly movies, premium investigative reports, and hard-hitting documentaries on issues that really matter, like the Chinese Communist Party's 100-year plan to defeat the United States, which I expose in my documentary, The Final War. The CCP is one of the biggest threats to the United States. They're using things like even video games, entertainment, movies, culture to influence and subvert the next generation. This unrestricted war against our country is one of the scariest but least understood issues of our time because it's not tangible. There's no tanks or bombs. It's all being done through soft power means and ideological subversion. I spent over a decade investigating the CCP subversion, and it's such an important issue that I've dedicated my career to warning people about the threats of the CCP. Now, if you'd like to find out what's exactly going on in the CCP's plot against America, watch The Final War. You can find the link in the description below, and I'll show you all a trailer before you go exclusively to EpochTV.com for the rest of this episode. I'll see you there.
The greatest threat facing the United States is the CCP.
The Epoch Times investigation team had studied the CCP for years, but what we uncovered was yielding evidence beyond our imagination.
With Chairman Mao, with the Prime Minister, our talks have been characterized by frankness.
The Clinton administration said, oh, don't worry about it. This will be a poison pill for China.
China's strategic goal is to make sure that the U.S. has 4 enemies, and one of them must be a terrorist group.
We are giving of our life's blood so that the Chinese Communist Party can survive and thrive.